He wasn't supposed to come back to anything, let alone a house that felt like it had been waiting for him. The gravel cracked under Ethan Cole's boots as he stepped out of the rented pickup, the engine ticking softly behind him, still warm from the long drive across 3 states and too many memories he never asked to revisit. The mansion stood at the end of a narrow road, wrapped in tall oaks that whispered in the late afternoon wind, their branches casting long, restless shadows across the faded stone walls. It wasn't abandoned, not exactly, but it didn't feel lived in either. It felt paused. Like something had taken a breath years ago and never let it out. Rex moved first. The German Shepherd slipped out of the passenger side with quiet precision, his paws landing softly on the gravel, ears forward, body low, alert in a way Ethan hadn't seen since their last deployment. The dog didn't bark. He didn't need to. His stillness said enough. Ethan adjusted the strap of his duffel bag over his shoulder, eyes scanning the property the way he'd been trained to scan unfamiliar terrain, measuring distance, angles, exits. Old habits didn't fade. They just went quiet until something woke them up again. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though his voice carried less certainty than the words suggested. Rex didn't look back. His gaze was fixed on the front door, slightly ajar, moving just enough with the breeze to make a soft, uneven creak. No welcome mat. No lights. Just that door, waiting. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air tasting faintly of damp wood and something older, something he couldn't quite name. This was what his grandmother left him. No explanation. No letter. Just a deed, a set of keys, and a condition: stay for 30 days. He hadn't seen her in years. Not since before everything changed. And yet somehow this felt intentional. Like she knew he'd end up here when he had nowhere else to go. Rex took a step forward, then stopped abruptly, his body stiffening as a low, almost inaudible growl formed in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. Ethan felt it too then, a subtle shift in the air, like the house itself had noticed them standing there. The wind died down. The trees fell. Quiet. Even the distant hum of the highway seemed to fade into nothing. "You smell that?" Ethan whispered, though he already knew Rex did. The dog moved again, slower now, each step deliberate, as if following a trail only he could see. Ethan followed, boots heavier with each step toward the porch, the old wood groaning under his weight as he climbed the 3 worn steps. Up close, the door looked older than the rest of the house, its paint chipped, the brass handle dulled with time. He reached out, hesitated for just a second, then pushed it open. The hinges let out a long, tired sound, like something waking up after too long in the dark. Inside, the air was cooler, still, carrying the faint scent of dust and something metallic beneath it. Rex stepped in first. Ethan followed. And the door, without a sound this time, drifted closed behind them. The silence inside the house did not feel empty, it felt occupied, like a room that remembered every voice that had ever passed through it and refused to forget. Ethan stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through tall windows layered with dust, the late sun stretching across the wooden floor in long pale strips that revealed every footprint, every mark time had left behind. Rex moved ahead slowly, his nails clicking softly against the floor, then stopping, then moving again, as if listening between each step. Ethan set his duffel bag down near the doorway, the sound echoing farther than it should have in a house this size, and something about that echo made his chest tighten in a way he could not explain. The air carried a faint chill, not cold enough to see his breath, but enough to settle into his bones, the kind of cold that came from stillness, not weather. He glanced toward the staircase rising along the far wall, its railing carved with details worn smooth by hands long gone, and for a second, he thought he saw movement at the top, just a shift of shadow, nothing more, but it was enough to make him pause. Rex noticed it too. The dog stopped mid-step, head tilting slightly, ears locked forward, his body going completely still as he stared up the stairs. No bark. No growl. Just focus. Nothing there, Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to the dog, though the words did not carry much conviction. He forced himself to move, stepping deeper into the room, each step stirring faint traces of dust that caught the light like drifting ash. The furniture was still in place, covered in thin sheets that had settled over time, giving everything a ghost-like shape, familiar yet distant. A couch. A long table. A chair angled slightly toward the fireplace as if someone had just stood up and never returned. Ethan reached out and pulled one of the sheets back, revealing dark wood polished beneath, untouched by decay, preserved in a way that felt deliberate. His grandmother had not abandoned this place. She had sealed it. Rex broke his stillness then, turning away from the stairs and moving toward the far wall where a narrow hallway disappeared into darkness. His pace quickened, not in panic, but with purpose, his nose low, tracking something Ethan could not see. "Rex," Ethan called softly, but the dog did not stop. He followed, the hallway swallowing the light behind them, the temperature dropping another few degrees as they moved deeper into the house. The walls here were lined with framed photographs, each one slightly tilted, each one catching just enough light to reveal glimpses of faces, uniforms, places Ethan did not recognize at first glance. He slowed, his hand brushing lightly against one frame, straightening it without thinking, and when he looked closer, his breath caught. The man in the photograph wore a uniform he knew too well, posture straight, expression steady, eyes that carried something familiar, something that mirrored his own. His father. Younger than Ethan had ever seen him, standing beside a woman who could only be his grandmother, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, her expression softer than Ethan remembered. Rex let out a low sound then, not a growl, not a whine, something in between, and Ethan turned to see the dog standing at the end of the hallway, paw pressed lightly against a section of the wall that looked no different from the rest. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. Rex did not move his paw. He pressed again, firmer this time, and the sound that followed was subtle but unmistakable, a hollow shift behind the wood, like space where there should not be any. Ethan ran his hand along the paneling, fingers tracing the seams, until he felt it, a slight indentation, a hidden latch worn smooth by use. He hesitated, just for a second, the weight of something unseen pressing against his chest, then he pushed. The wall gave way with a quiet click, opening just enough to reveal darkness beyond, and from somewhere inside that hidden space, a faint metallic scent drifted out, sharp and familiar, like something buried not just in the house, but in memory itself. The hidden door opened only a few inches, just enough for the darkness beyond to breathe into the hallway, carrying that same faint metallic scent, sharper now, like old steel and something long sealed away. Ethan did not move right away. His hand remained on the edge of the panel, fingers tense, as if the wood itself might pull back if he let go too quickly. Rex stepped closer, silent but unwavering, his body angled toward the opening, his tail low, his focus absolute. He did not hesitate. He never did when something mattered. Ethan exhaled slowly, then pushed the door wider. The hinges barely made a sound, as if they had been maintained, cared for, waiting. Inside was a narrow passage, just wide enough for one person to walk through at a time, the walls unfinished, raw wood framing a path that sloped gently downward. The temperature dropped immediately, the air cooler, denser, carrying a stillness that felt different from the rest of the house. This was not neglect. This was intention. Rex moved first again, stepping into the passage with careful precision, his nose low, tracking that same invisible thread. Ethan followed, ducking slightly as the ceiling lowered, the dim light from the hallway fading behind them until only a thin strip remained, then disappeared entirely as the panel drifted closed on its own with a soft, final click. The darkness did not last long. A single bulb flickered to life ahead, casting a dull yellow glow that revealed a small room at the end of the passage. It was not large, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, but everything inside it felt deliberate. A metal table stood in the center, its surface clean despite the years. Along the walls, shelves held neatly stacked boxes, each one labeled in careful handwriting. Dates. Locations. Names. Ethan stepped closer, his pulse steady but heavier now, the kind of weight that came not from fear, but from recognition. He had seen rooms like this before. Not in houses. In places where truth was stored because it could not be spoken out loud. Rex circled once, then stopped beside the table, sitting down with a quiet certainty that made Ethan pause. The dog's gaze was fixed on something resting in the center of the metal surface. A small recorder. Old, but intact. Beside it, a single set of dog tags lay coiled in a loose loop, the chain catching the dim light with a faint glint. Ethan felt something shift in his chest before he even reached for them. He knew what he was about to see. His hand hovered above the tags for a moment, then closed around the cool metal. The weight was familiar. The shape unmistakable. He turned them over slowly, the engraved letters catching the light one line at a time until the name came fully into view. His father's name. Not crossed out. Not hidden. Preserved. Rex let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, as if something long carried had finally settled. Ethan swallowed, his throat tightening as memory and reality collided in a way that made it hard to separate one from the other. He had been told a story his entire life. A simple one. Clean. Final. But nothing about this room felt simple. He set the tags down carefully and reached for the recorder. For a second, his hand hesitated again, not from uncertainty, but from the quiet understanding that whatever was inside this device would change something that could not be changed back. Rex shifted slightly, pressing closer to his leg, a steady presence, grounding, real. Ethan pressed the button. At first, there was only static, a soft crackle that filled the small room, then a voice emerged, faint but unmistakable, older, steadier, carrying a warmth that time had not erased. His grandmother. "If you are hearing this," the voice said. Gently, "then you came back when you had nowhere else left to go." Ethan closed his eyes for just a moment, the sound of her voice anchoring him in a way he had not expected. Rex remained still beside him, listening. The voice continued, calm, deliberate, each word placed with care. "There are truths this house was never meant to hide forever, only to protect until the right hands could carry them." The bulb above flickered once, casting brief shadows along the walls, and in that shifting light, Ethan realized something he had not allowed himself to consider until now. This was not an inheritance. It was a responsibility. The voice on the recorder did not rush, it unfolded slowly, like someone who had spent years choosing the exact words for a moment they might never witness, and yet believed it would come. Ethan stood motionless, the device steady in his hand, while the faint hum of the bulb above filled the silence between each sentence. "Your father was not meant to be remembered the way they told you," his grandmother's voice continued, calm but carrying something deeper beneath it, something that felt like both sorrow and resolve. Rex shifted slightly, his shoulder pressing against Ethan's leg, grounding him as the word settled into the room. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the shelves lining the walls, the labeled boxes now feeling less like storage and more like pieces of a story waiting to be assembled. "He chose truth when others chose silence," the voice said, and for a moment, the air itself seemed to hold that sentence in place, as if the room understood its weight. Ethan lowered himself into the chair beside the metal table without realizing he had moved, the old wood creaking softly beneath him, his eyes fixed on the recorder as though it were the only stable point in a world that had begun to shift. "There are people who will not want you to find what he left behind," the voice continued, softer now, more personal, "but I did not raise you to walk away from what is right simply because it is difficult." Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand tightening slightly around the edge of the table, the cool metal anchoring him as memories surfaced, fragments of conversations, of questions that had never been fully answered, of a silence that had always felt too clean to be true. Rex stood then, moving away from Ethan for the first time since entering the room, his steps quiet but purposeful as he approached one of the lower shelves. He paused, nose hovering just above a box labeled with a date Ethan recognized, a year that had been mentioned in passing more than once, always quickly, always without detail. The dog looked back once, just a brief glance, then nudged the box with his nose. It shifted slightly, enough to reveal that it was not as fixed in place as the others. Ethan rose slowly, the movement deliberate, as if any sudden action might disturb something fragile in the air. He crossed the small room and crouched beside Rex, his fingers brushing the edge of the box before lifting it carefully from the shelf. It was heavier than it looked, the cardboard reinforced, sealed with a strip of tape that had yellowed with time but remained intact. He hesitated again, not out of fear but out of respect for the moment, then peeled the tape back with a quiet, steady motion. Inside were folders, each one marked with precise handwriting, each one carrying the same name that now rested on the dog tags behind him. His father's name, repeated again and again, across documents, reports, letters. Not erased. Not forgotten. Preserved. The recorder continued to play, his grandmother's voice threading through the silence. I kept these here because I believed one day you would need to see him as he truly was, not as the world chose to remember him. Ethan lifted one of the folders, opening it slowly, his eye scanning the first page, then the next, the words forming a picture that did not align with anything he had been told. It was not chaos. It was clarity. It was intention. Rex remained beside him, sitting now, watching not the papers, but Ethan, as if measuring something deeper than understanding. You are not here by accident, the voice said, the final word softer, almost a whisper, and neither is he. The bulb flickered again, briefly dimming before returning to its steady glow, and in that moment of shifting light, Ethan realized that whatever this place had been holding all these years, it was no longer hidden. It was waiting for him to decide what to do with it. The paper in Ethan's hands did not tremble, but something deeper did, something quiet and steady that had carried questions for years without ever finding a place to set them down. The words on the page were precise, structured, written in a tone he recognized from official reports, but beneath that structure there was something else, something human, something that did not belong in a document meant to be archived and forgotten. Rex remained beside him, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of his breath, his presence constant, as if he understood that this moment required stillness more than action. Ethan turned another page, then another, each one adding weight rather than clarity, each line reshaping the memory he had held onto for so long. His father had not disappeared into silence. He had stepped into it. Chosen it. Not for himself, but for something larger, something that had never been explained, only erased. The recorder had gone quiet now, the soft click at the end of the tape barely noticeable, but the absence of his grandmother's voice made the room feel heavier, as if her words had been holding something back that was now free to settle fully around him. Ethan set the folder down carefully on the metal table, his fingers lingering for a moment before pulling away, and he stood slowly, drawing in a breath that felt different from the ones before it. Not easier. Not lighter. Just clearer. Rex rose with him immediately, stepping forward as if anticipating the shift, his ears lifting slightly as he turned his head toward the passage they had come through. There was no sound, nothing obvious, but something in the air had changed. Ethan felt it too, a subtle tension, like the moment before a storm when the wind holds its breath. He did not speak. He did not need to. He reached back and picked up the dog tags again, slipping them into his pocket this time instead of setting them down, the metal cool against his palm before disappearing from sight. They felt heavier there, not because of their weight, but because of what they now carried. Rex moved toward the passage, pausing at the threshold, his body angled slightly as he listened, his focus shifting between the room and the hallway beyond. Ethan followed, taking one last look at the shelves, the boxes, the room that had held the truth longer than anyone had known, then stepped into the narrow passage behind the dog. The light from the bulb did not follow them far, fading quickly as they moved back toward the hidden door, the air warming slightly with each step, though the sense of stillness remained. When they reached the end, Ethan pressed the panel again, the latch releasing with the same quiet click, and the wall shifted open just enough to let the dim light of the hallway spill back in. Rex stepped through first, his movements faster now, less cautious, as if something ahead had drawn his attention more strongly than anything behind them. Ethan followed, closing the panel behind him, the scene disappearing almost instantly into the wall as if it had never been there at all. The hallway felt different now, the photographs no longer just images but fragments of a story he had begun to understand, each frame holding a piece of something that had been deliberately scattered. Rex moved quickly toward the front of the house, his pace steady but urgent, his nails tapping against the floor in a rhythm that echoed faintly through the quiet space. Ethan kept up, his senses sharpening, the training he had tried to leave behind rising quietly back into place, not as a burden, but as a tool. As they entered the main room again, the light had shifted, the sun lower now, casting longer shadows that stretched across the floor and up the walls, turning familiar shapes into something less certain. The front door stood exactly as they had left it, closed, unmoved, but something about it felt different, as if the world outside had changed while they had been inside. Rex stopped a few feet from it, his body still, his gaze fixed, his ears forward in that same focused silence. Ethan slowed beside him, his hand instinctively lowering toward the dog's back, not to restrain him, but to steady himself. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, from beyond the door, came the faintest sound. Not loud. Not sudden. Just the soft crunch of gravel, slow and deliberate, as if someone had taken a single step and then paused, waiting. The sound did not come again right away, and that was what made it worse, the way it lingered in the air like a question that refused to answer itself. Ethan stood still beside Rex, his breathing steady but controlled, his eyes fixed on the door as his mind began to map the space around him without effort, counting steps, angles, exits, the old training rising not as panic but as instinct. Rex did not move either, his body firm, ears locked forward, every line of him focused on what lay beyond the wood. There was no bark, no warning, just that quiet, unshakable certainty that something was there. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, slow enough that the floor beneath him did not protest, his hand brushing lightly against Rex's back for just a moment before falling away. "Stay," he whispered, though the dog had not given any sign of breaking position. The word was not a command. It was a promise. Another sound followed then, softer this time, not the crunch of gravel, but the faint movement of fabric against air, like someone adjusting their stance just beyond the threshold. Ethan stepped forward, each movement deliberate, controlled, until he stood inches from the door. The handle was cold beneath his fingers, colder than it should have been, as if it had been waiting in shadow too long. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he listened, the silence on the other side stretching thin, fragile, like it might break if touched too suddenly. Then, without warning, Rex's posture shifted. Not aggressive. Not alarmed. Something else. His ears eased back slightly, his body lowering just a fraction, not in fear but in recognition. Ethan felt it before he understood it, that subtle change, the way the tension in the room bent instead of snapping. He turned his head just enough to glance at the dog, and in that brief second, something passed between them, something unspoken but clear. This was not a threat. But it was not nothing. Ethan turned the handle slowly, the latch, releasing with a soft click that seemed louder than it was, and pulled the door open just enough to see the outline of a figure standing a few feet away on the gravel path. The light outside had shifted into early evening, casting the figure in long shadow, the details blurred at first, then slowly coming into focus as Ethan's eyes adjusted. A man, older, perhaps in his late 60s, wearing a simple jacket and jeans, his posture straight but not rigid, his hands visible, empty, resting loosely at his sides. He did not step forward. He did not speak right away. He simply stood there, as if he had been waiting not just for the door to open, but for the moment to arrive. Rex moved then, stepping past Ethan without hesitation, his pace calm, measured, his tail low but no longer stiff. He approached the man directly, stopping just a foot away, his head tilting slightly as he looked up. The man did not reach out immediately. He waited, letting the dog decide, his expression softening in a way that suggested familiarity rather than surprise. After a moment, Rex closed the distance himself, pressing his nose lightly against the man's hand, inhaling, confirming. The man exhaled slowly, almost like relief, and finally rested his hand gently on the dog's head, his fingers moving through the fur with a familiarity that did not need explanation. Ethan stepped out onto the porch then, the wood creaking softly beneath his weight, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the man more closely. There was something about him, something in the way he stood, the way he looked at the house, not as a stranger would, but as someone who had known it before time had settled over it. "You took your time getting here," the man said finally, his voice calm, steady, carrying no accusation, only quiet observation. Ethan did not respond right away. He let the words settle, measuring them, the same way he measured everything now. "Do I know you?" he asked, his tone even, controlled, though the question carried more weight than it appeared to. The man's gaze shifted from Rex back to Ethan, and for a brief moment, something deeper passed through his expression, something like memory, or perhaps recognition. "Not yet," he said softly, "but your father did." The air between them stilled again, not with tension this time, but with something heavier, something that felt like the edge of a truth that had been waiting far longer than either of them had. The words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the space between them like something that had finally found where it belonged. Ethan did not step back, and he did not step forward either. He held his ground on the porch, the old wood steady beneath his boots, his eyes fixed on the man as if searching for something that could confirm or deny what he had just heard. Rex remained at the man's side, calm now, his posture relaxed in a way Ethan had learned to trust more than any signal of alarm. The dog did not give his trust lightly. That alone said more than anything else could. "My father is not here to answer for that," Ethan said after a moment, his voice even, controlled, though something beneath it had shifted, something quieter, heavier. The man nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if he had expected that response. "No," he said softly, his hand still resting lightly on Rex's head, "he is not. That is why I am." The wind moved through the trees again, gentle this time, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant earth, and for a moment the world felt almost ordinary, as if the weight of the house behind Ethan had not followed him out onto the porch. But it had. He could feel it, like a presence just beyond his shoulder. "You came for something," Ethan said, not a question, just a statement shaped by instinct more than assumption. The man's gaze shifted briefly toward the house, his eyes tracing the outline of the structure with a familiarity that was too precise to be coincidence. "I came because your grandmother knew you would not understand it all at once," he replied, his tone steady, measured, each word placed carefully, "and she believed you would need someone who remembered the parts she could not say out loud." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in focus, the kind that came when pieces began to move into place whether he wanted them to or not. "Then start talking," he said. The man studied him for a brief moment, not evaluating, not judging, simply recognizing something in him that did not need to be explained. He took a slow breath, then stepped forward, closing the distance to the bottom step of the porch, but no further. "Your father was not alone in what he found," he began, his voice lower now, quieter, as if the truth itself required a different tone, "and he was not the only one who chose to carry it." Rex shifted slightly, his body turning just enough to keep both men in view, his presence still calm, but attentive, as if he understood that whatever was being said now mattered more than anything that had come before. "There were others," the man continued, "men who saw what he saw, who understood what it meant, and who agreed that some things could not be allowed to disappear just because they made people uncomfortable." Ethan felt the words settle into him, not as information, but as recognition, each sentence aligning with something he had read, something he had sensed in the room below the house, something that had never been fully explained but had always been there beneath the surface. "And you were one of them," Ethan said quietly. The man did not hesitate. "Yes," he answered. No pride. No hesitation. Just truth. The simplicity of it made it heavier. "Then why are you here now?" Ethan asked, his voice tightening just slightly, not from anger, but from the pressure of everything that had begun to unfold. The man's expression softened, not in weakness, but in something closer to understanding. "Because your father trusted me with something he could not leave behind," he said, his eyes meeting Ethan's fully now, steady and clear, "and I have been waiting to return it to the only person he would have wanted to carry it next." The air stilled again, not with tension this time, but with something deeper, something that felt like the edge of a decision that had already begun to form. Ethan did not speak. He did not need to. He simply stood there, the weight of the house behind him, the presence of the man before him, and the quiet, unwavering steadiness of Rex beside them both as the shape of a truth he had never been given slowly became something he would have to choose to carry. The man did not reach into his pocket right away, and that hesitation carried more meaning than any sudden movement could have. It was not uncertainty. It was respect, as if whatever he carried did not belong to him long enough to treat it casually. Ethan watched closely, his posture still, his attention sharpened into something quiet and exact. Rex shifted slightly between them, not as a barrier but as a presence that connected both sides of the moment, his eyes moving from one man to the other with steady awareness. The man finally moved, slow and deliberate, slipping his hand into the inside of his jacket and drawing out a small, weathered envelope, its edges softened by time, its surface marked with faint creases that suggested it had been opened and closed more than once, but never discarded. He held it for a second, looking down at it, not with hesitation, but with something closer to memory, then extended it toward Ethan without a word. Ethan did not take it immediately. He let the space between them hold for just a moment longer, measuring not the object, but the weight behind it. Then he stepped forward and accepted it, his fingers brushing briefly against the man's as he did, the contact light but grounding. The envelope felt heavier than paper should, not in weight, but in meaning. Rex stepped closer as Ethan lowered his gaze, his nose briefly touching the edge of the envelope, as if confirming what Ethan could not yet see. The world around them remained still, the wind quiet, the trees unmoving, as if even the air understood that something was about to shift. Ethan opened the envelope carefully, sliding a finger beneath the worn flap and lifting it without tearing, preserving it the way someone preserves something that cannot be replaced. Inside was a single folded document and a photograph. He took the photograph first. The image was faded, the colors softened by time, but the details were still clear enough to recognize. His father stood in the center, not in uniform this time, but in plain clothes, his expression calm, his posture relaxed in a way Ethan had never seen before. Beside him stood the man now on the porch, younger then, but unmistakable, the same steady presence, the same eyes that carried more than they revealed. And between them, barely reaching their waists, was a younger version of Ethan himself, no more than 8 years old, smiling in a way he had not remembered until now. The memory did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, small pieces of a day that had been pushed aside by everything that followed. A yard. A warm afternoon. Laughter that had not carried weight. Ethan's breath slowed as he lowered the photograph, the edges of something long buried beginning to come back into focus. "You were there," he said quietly, not as a question, but as recognition finally catching up to reality. The man nodded once, his expression unchanged, but his eyes softer now, as if the distance between past and present had finally closed. "I was," he said. Ethan set the photograph aside carefully, then unfolded the document, his fingers steady despite the shift inside him. The paper was official, structured, carrying the same tone he had seen in the folders below, but this time there was no removal, no redaction, no attempt to hide what it contained. It was a statement. Signed. Witnessed. His father's name at the bottom, clear and unbroken. The words were direct, outlining something that had never been meant to surface publicly, something that had been contained, controlled, and ultimately buried beneath silence rather than addressed. Ethan read slowly, each line adding clarity instead of confusion, each sentence reinforcing what the room below had already begun to reveal. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice. His father had chosen to document the truth knowing it might never be acknowledged, and someone had chosen to protect that truth rather than erase it. Ethan lowered the paper, his gaze lifting back to the man, the space between them no longer uncertain, but defined by something shared. "Why keep this hidden for so long?" he asked, his voice quieter now, not demanding, but seeking something deeper than explanation. The man took a slow breath, his eyes briefly shifting toward the house before returning to Ethan. "Because truth does not always survive when it is exposed too early," he said gently. "Sometimes it needs to be carried until the right person is ready to hold it without breaking it." The word settled into Ethan with a weight that felt different from everything that had come before. Not pressure. Not confusion. Something steadier. Rex leaned lightly against Ethan's leg, his presence unchanged, constant, as if he had been waiting not for the truth itself, but for this moment when Ethan would finally understand what to do with it. The light had almost faded by the time Ethan stepped fully off the porch, the sky shifting into that quiet blue that comes just before night settles in, when everything feels suspended between what was and what is about to be. The envelope remained in his hand, the paper inside no longer something hidden, but something chosen. Rex stayed close at his side, his presence steady, his pace matching Ethan's without needing direction, as if he understood that this moment was not about movement, but about decision. The man did not follow immediately. He remained near the base of the steps, giving space not out of distance, but out of respect, as if he knew that whatever came next did not belong to him anymore. Ethan walked a few feet out onto the gravel, the soft crunch beneath his boots grounding him in something real, something present, and he stopped, looking out toward the tree line where the last light filtered through the branches. For a long moment, he said nothing. He did not look at the house. He did not look at the man. He just stood there, holding the weight of everything he had been given, not as a burden, but as something that had finally found where it belonged. Rex shifted slightly, pressing his shoulder against Ethan's leg, a quiet reminder that he was not standing there alone. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, then turned back toward the porch. The man was watching him, not with expectation, but with patience, the kind that comes from having waited long enough to understand that some things cannot be rushed. Ethan stepped forward again, closing the distance between them, the envelope still in his hand, but no longer uncertain. "You said he trusted you," Ethan said, his voice calm, even, but carrying something deeper now, something settled. The man nodded once. "He did." Ethan held his gaze for a moment, then glanced briefly toward the house behind him, the windows now dark, the structure no longer just a place, but a keeper of something that had outlasted silence. "Then he trusted you to wait," Ethan continued, "not to decide." The words were not sharp. They were clear. The man's expression shifted slightly, not in resistance, but in understanding, as if he had expected this outcome long before it arrived. "Yes," he said quietly. Ethan looked down at the envelope in his hand, then back up again, the movement small, but final. "Then I will carry it from here." There was no hesitation in the words. No uncertainty. Just choice. The kind that does not need to be announced to be understood. The man studied him for a brief moment, then nodded once more, a deeper acknowledgement this time, something closer to closure than agreement. "He would have wanted that," he said softly. Rex moved then, stepping forward just enough to stand between them again, his posture calm, his presence unchanged, as if marking the moment not as an ending, but as a transition. Ethan reached down briefly, his hand resting against the dog's neck, fingers pressing into the thick fur with a quiet familiarity that needed no words. The night settled further around them, the air cooling, the first faint sounds of insects beginning to rise from the grass, the world continuing in its quiet, steady way as if nothing had changed. But something had. Ethan turned back toward the house, not with hesitation, but with purpose, the steps beneath his boots no longer uncertain as he climbed them again. The door stood where he had left it, unchanged, but the space beyond it no longer felt unknown. It felt claimed. He paused at the threshold for just a second, his hand resting lightly against the frame, then stepped inside, Rex following without hesitation. Behind him, the man remained where he was, not calling out, not stepping forward, simply watching as the door closed once more, this time. Not with a sense of something hidden, but with the quiet certainty of something finally understood. Inside, the house was still. Not empty. Not silent. Just at rest. And for the first time since he had arrived, Ethan did not feel like a visitor. He felt like the one who had been meant to return.